Here, close to time. We're competing against a Grand Slam breakfast out there in the North Wing. So, so maybe there's a few people left out there. But today, today we're going to take up with Secretary of Agriculture Mike Beam. We thank him for being with us today, update us on where things are going and what they're doing. But first, I'll ask for any bill introductions.
There we go.
There you go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Joshua Swati on behalf of the municipal utilities want to introduce a bill dealing with the state revolving fund. This would be RS number 0300.
Any question from the seeing none? By consent, our policy is that if there's a dissension, then we have to do it in different, but otherwise this bill is introduced. Any other introductions? Seeing none, we're ready to get started. So we'll begin with our secretary. Thank you, Mr. Beam, for being here today for us. We're looking forward to it.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to talk about agriculture and be before this committee, perhaps one of the friendliest committees in regards to agriculture. As you'll see, we've put together quite a bit of information. I'm going to highlight some of those, anticipate some questions if you want to dive in a little bit deeper, or if you want to talk about some matters that I haven't flagged in this statement. But I always like to remind folks that agriculture's contribution to the Kansas economy is quite significant. In fact, we think it's the largest industry and economic driver when you think about all the sectors that are included in agriculture. We count 73 ag, food, and food processing sectors, and those have a direct input or output of over $53 billion. But if you look about indirect and induced, we're looking over, according to the M-Plan data, of $76 billion. And it also shows that about 14% of the state's workforce are working in those 73 sectors that have been identified. So one of the things that we do with this M-Plan data is not just look at statewide impact. We actually have that on a county-by-county basis. We have that on our website. So if you ever want to share with that information with your constituents, in your counties, we can show you how to get there if you're having any troubles with it. So it's quite interesting. I actually use that, and a lot of times if I'm speaking before a civic group and going to a county, I'll get that data and share with them, and it's somewhat, I think, interesting. And then on the one page, I was going to have him pull up the top sectors. Like I said, there's 73 sectors, but you'll see on page 9 of this testimony what those top 10 sectors are. And probably no surprise if you have a feel for agriculture, but on table 2 there, you'll see, beef cattle, all the various segments of beef cattle, and then animal processing, grain farming, meat processing, and pet food. Pet food has become quite a significant sector in this state as well. The other thing, too, that I like to show is how we rate or where we stand nationally as far as ag impact. And in the testimonies, it's a heat map based on 2017 agricultural census data. And I think he'll try to pull that one up. But I think it's significant to see that Kansas, particularly the southwest quadrant, is one of the hot spots across the country in where the total market value of agriculture is generated. So naturally, you'll see parts of California, you'll see, Texas Panhandle, a little bit in Oklahoma, southwest Kansas, but in the Corn Belt, of course, is a kind of a hot spot as well. So I'll talk a little bit about that, touch on that again, but I like to show that to folks, but also show some of those areas where the largest market value is generated is not necessarily the large populations. In fact, some of those are the smaller populated counties as well. So from an economic standpoint, it looks, for 2022, the grain, oilseed, and livestock markets, if you just look at the prices, they were fairly strong in 2022. Wheat, soybeans, and corn at one point in the year were really at historically high prices. The hog prices, fed cattle prices were also significantly above the 5-year average. But that doesn't tell the whole story. And what I like to tell folks, because I hear this quite frequently, farm production expenses are up considerably. It's not what you gross so much as what you net. And some of the statistics that KSU Farm Management put out showed that they expected 2022 farm expenses to be up 17.8%, which is one of the largest year-to-year increases. But they also projected that as you look forward, we could see expenses increase by maybe 39% or more. But the bright spot is ag exports. I think page 15 has a little outline of the ag exports from Kansas. But from Kansas in 2021, we'll have data later for 2022. We had $5.35 billion, which is the first time it's been over $5 billion in over a decade. Yes, a lot of that could be to the price value, but it's definitely the volume of products that come out of Kansas that go internationally. And then also on that report shows 80% of those are in categories of meat, edible offal, cereals, and oilseeds. Our destination countries, our big importing countries of U.S. goods, the top, or 75% of that would go to Mexico, Japan, China, South Korea, and Taiwan. So we should have sometime later this spring data from 2022, which should look similar as 2021. So one of the ways that we tried to analyze what the various sectors of agriculture want as far as growing and how the role that the Department of Ag can play is a series of sector by sector, usually virtual, that leads up to our Ag Growth Summit. So we had our Ag Growth Summit in person in August, and through that process we focused on 18 ag sectors. The one thing, some of those points you'll see that came out is continued emphasis on education opportunities, the training of students for modern agricultural use, developing strong relationships with post-secondary institutions and the agribusiness world, funding for increased research, to keep Kansas agriculture on the cutting edge. I don't know if any of you were able to attend the Landon lecture with the CEO of Land O'Lakes, but she made a strong case for we are way behind compared to other countries on public research for agriculture, and made an emphasis that we shouldn't lose track of that. But as you lead into one of the common themes and issues that was across all sectors was workforce. It's not just in ag, but it's in the service industries, it's in construction and many others. But it was clear from the input that we received from those sectors that workforce availability is a barrier, a significant barrier to growth for Kansas agriculture. We have a shortage of workers for beef, pet food, pork, ag equipment manufacturing, ag technology, and meat processing. And it was also identified at that at our Ag Growth Summit, particularly with a panel of people that were dealing with the challenges, is we definitely need some federal immigration reform, particularly as it relates to ag workers. We were, I guess, encouraged to see that the Federal Farm Workforce Modernization Act passed the House in a fairly bipartisan manner, but it kind of ran out of steam as they got towards the end of the session to try to get it through. But it's our hope that the interest, and there's the coalition that's behind getting modernization in this area is it's pages of people, entities, organizations that are seeking some changes and reform in especially the visas program. We also had our workforce survey this year, and that's highlighted on page 16 and 16 through 18. I was excited to see the number of responses. We had very, very strong response rate. We had a lot more responses than we did the last time that we held this survey. But it, I think, was an indication of how much of a hot button this issue is to employers. And based on the people who responded, you'll see the one graph that the largest need for critical positions that was identified by that group was the CDL and equipment operators, followed by general labor and unskilled workers, which I hesitate to use the word unskilled, but I think there's probably a definition of that, but these are all these folks that we need would have skills, particularly work ethic and so forth. So that might be interesting to peruse through, but you'll see that it continues to be a very important barrier for growth in agriculture and perhaps our state as a whole. So I was going to touch a little bit about drought and water because I know you'll be talking about that at some point as ag and natural resources. But all of you, I'm sure, have followed that the 2022 drought affected all of Kansas. Of course, 67 of those counties were in an emergency status. It had a big loss or impact to our crop production and our forage production, and it continued to give us some concerns about threats for wildfires. And this, I think, highlighted some of the concerns or thoughts about the Ogallala Aquifer, which continues to provide the water for our ag, the breadbasket. And what I showed you in that heat map is heavily dependent upon that source of water. So we'll know more about the impact it's had on the level in the aquifer every year. The Division of Water Resources and the Kansas Geological Survey goes out starting the first week of January and measures, I think it's over 1,000 wells. It's always the same wells, so they can have a good baseline. And that data will be out sometime here, probably before spring. I think would be interesting to share that with you, and there'll be a lot of public interest in what's the drought done to the level of the aquifer. Because of the pumping and the demands on the aquifer this year, because of the drought, we've had a lot of interest in the multi-year flex account. That is a tool that's available to water users. If they get to the point where they're trying to finish their crop and they're up against their authorized use, they can apply for a multi-year flex account, which will take that into consideration and average that out over 5 years. One thing I hope that people realize and think about it, if there's some discussions about water policy, particularly as it relates to groundwater. But when I showed you that heat map, I think it's pretty clear that our robust ag economy is significantly bolstered in the region by the overlaying Ogallala Aquifer. And it's really difficult for me to imagine how this region and really our entire state might have fared economically without the availability of this resource and the investments and risks taken by multiple generations of farm and ranch families and agribusinesses. Now there's considerable attention to the depletion, but we also need to think about that relates to the economic viability, future economic viability of agriculture and our rural communities, particularly when we get into drought situation. I continue to be hopeful that all of us working together can maybe make some meaningful changes to chart a more promising outcome for future generations. This year, we've had to deal with avian influenza, also called highly pathogenic avian influenza. We started in February of last year, but all but 3 states have had to deal with this disease. In total, I think the last count is through USDA and the states, there's been a depopulation of about 57 million birds, domestic birds. It is a highly contagious disease, and we have been fortunate in our state not to have to deal with it near to the extent that other states have. We had our first one in April. We've had it now in 11 counties with just over 20,000 birds. Most of those are what are considered backyard flocks. We've had 2 commercial operations, but again, dramatically fewer than other states. And in fact, tomorrow we'll be in north central Kansas doing a depopulation on game breeder. The last 2 that we've had in Kansas have been the game bird farms, which creates a pretty significant blow to that individual. Fortunately, USDA has an indemnity program, which in some cases may or may not cover what the total value is, but it is a way to help cover for that loss. I think it's important to note that this disease, compared to what it was last time it went rampant through the United States, is this does not appear to be spreading from flock to flock, from domestic flock to flock like it did previously. It almost looks exclusively to be spread by wild birds, waterfowl particularly, and it kind of raises its head as you get into both the migratory seasons going north and south. So we suspect that we'll see an influx again in the spring as the wild birds move north. But I would say I think the industry learned from the previous outbreak and have really implemented a lot more biosecurity than they've had in the past, which is part of the reason we haven't seen the spread from flock to flock. So this this kind of leads into one of the key roles of the Department of Ag that we've focused on, and it started previous to this administration. But emergency preparedness is one of the priorities of the agency. And we know that we can have situations like the highly pathogenic avian influenza. But we also know of diseases like African swine fever and foot and mouth disease that could significantly impact our state, even if it's not in the state. So we continue to have a series of emergency prepared exercises, multiple days. This year, we've had it in December. We had over 150 people participate in that exercise. The encouraging thing was to see multiple state agencies because when you get into this situation, you'll need collaboration with Kansas Department of Health and Environment, Kansas Department of Transportation, Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. There's a whole host of those agencies that will be involved, including Kansas Division of Emergency Management. We have lots of participation from USDA officials. And some from the private sector were there to observe and participate, which we welcome. But we even had some representatives of animal health agencies in Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Texas who came up or came here to learn about this because I think USDA would tell you that Kansas is by far the farthest along in developing emergency response plans for foreign animal disease. So we're held out by USDA and others as kind of the model, but we're not done. It's kind of like an athletic team. You always have to improve. So that's a very big priority. I was asked last spring to help with a wildfire task force. Governor Kelly appointed this group. And we had our first meeting in July, and we had a series of 5 meetings. We just had one the first week of January. It's been really interesting. I've learned a lot because that task force is made up of local emergency managers, the county commissioners, firefighters, fire chiefs, Forest Service, Division of Emergency Management, farmers and ranchers who've been impacted by wildfires. And we've had lots of good discussions. I think everybody was a little bit guarded at first, but as we moved along through the meetings, we had some good discussions, and we have some draft recommendations. It's kind of now up to me to try to pull this report together and get back to the task force. So hopefully you'll get to see more about that yet this session. Some of the tentative recommendations I've included in my statement, but better information about very timely on the fire danger index, which has improved considerably in recent years. Mutual aid systems, there can be some improvements in that. That's basically when somebody at the local level makes the call for assistance from neighboring counties or neighboring firefighters. So that may be something that needs some bolster. Continuing, we had suggestions that it'd be nice somehow if we could provide more support for volunteer firefighters because they have to be, most of them have another job, and encouraging employers to support those employees that are involved in local volunteer fire departments. And of course, mitigation, we spent a lot of time on mitigation. And what's happened over the last 50 years is we've had certain areas of the state where there's been a lot of growth of woody species, and we've got some areas that are very prone to heavy fuel loads if we get into wildfire situations. So I think there's a consensus that we need to try to help identify those and be proactive to address that. We have put considerable emphasis on local food. There seems to be, since the pandemic, lots more interest in sourcing food locally. And also, we seem to have more and more interest from individuals who want to get into that business. We were pleased that we received a grant from USDA that's called the Local Food Purchase Assistant Cooperative Agreement Program. As with any grant, there's certain requirements that have to be made. So one, there has to be, has to clearly be food produced by, small family farmers locally, and it has to be dispersed to those areas socially disadvantaged. So the way we structured this program is to work with the food banks, and so producers will sign up and be registered with the Department of Ag, and then they can go to those food banks, then food banks will receive the money to purchase the food, and then we know that through their distribution system it will meet the requirements of the grant. I mentioned pet food has continued to be a growing industry, not just in Kansas, but worldwide. But we've seen a lot of expansions over the last year. I made some examples in my testimony. But, Simmons Pet Food expanded in 2 communities. J.M. Smucker and Company sold their business to Diamond Pet Foods with a manufacturing plant in Frontenac. Hill's Pet Nutrition, they have a very extensive research facility here outside Topeka and have announced their expansion into Leavenworth County. There's some other examples, but I think it's interesting to note that the manufacturing equipment that's used to make most of the pet food, and perhaps worldwide, is actually manufactured here in Kansas, and particularly at Sabetha. So there's also been considerable interest in particularly improving soil and working on being more sustainable, and USDA has put a great deal of emphasis on that. You may have read where they put out climate-smart commodities grants. They awarded quite a few grants to the tune of $3 billion. There were 20 awardees in the state. almost all of those are multiple entities that put together a joint proposal. And the Kansas Department of Ag is a partner in some of those, particularly through our Division of Conservation and the local conservation districts. So they'll be providing resources for individual producers who want to do more adaptation to particularly soil health practices. And I'll end with the hemp. This is our 4th year of a hemp program in Kansas. Of course, it was first authorized in the 2013 Farm Bill as a research project, and now in 2018 as a commercial program. But we're one of 43 states who have a program. The other states have their growers go through USDA's program. But there seems to be a little more interest in the fiber and grain than there was originally. About 5% for cannabinoid production. Our acreage has decreased 33% from 21 to 22. Our acres increased, though, by 68%, and our harvest rate is increased by 101%. A lot of times the failure of that is in poor germination or adverse weather, particularly like this year, and unavailability of water. For 2022, we had 61 licensed hemp producers, and it's important to note a couple years ago, you as a legislature made a change where those who are hemp processors, they are to be licensed and regulated by the state fire marshal. So we've developed a pretty good working relationship of sharing information back and forth with them. So, Mr. Chairman, I've kind of touched on several topics, maybe not what you wanted to hear, but I'm sure it's a privilege to serve in this capacity and work with you, and I'd be glad to respond to any questions or concerns that you might have.
Certainly, thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your report, and I'm sure there'll be questions. And your little packet here, summarizing all these high points here, is loaded with a lot of big stuff. I mean, those things are huge of importance to Kansas and all the members. And you summarized it very well, so enough that we could curb our interest on what's going forward. So thank you very much for that. And so we'll get into the questions. First, I had Senator McGinn with a question.
Thank you. On the migratory birds, do we include geese as migratory anymore? So
we know geese are one of the spreaders of this.
they don't, but they don't leave anymore.
Oh,
Stay.
they probably have. I mean, it's pretty. I think it's apparent that the fact that the disease, you can chart where the disease, the hot spots go, comes from the migration. But that's not to say wild waterfowl that stay locally. I mean, they could certainly harbor it to some degree.
Okay, I was just curious about that because again, they just hang out. But I wanted to ask the corn people this yesterday, but we ran out of time. In this magazine, page 23, it talks about what corn farmers have reduced, greenhouse, erosion. And so back to the soil erosion situation in our area, someone came in and had a chopper and took all the corn stalk off of the ground, big old bales. I think they went to a dairy somewhere, southeast, south, or north. But it kind of defeats the whole purpose of, we started out saying we're going to put shelter belts out to help, after the 30s. And then they said, no, that really doesn't help. Trash farming is what helps. Leaving that debris out there so that when the wind blows, we don't have erosion. After they cut all that stalk off, it's dry, right? And we had huge winds. And you couldn't even see, one corner I could hardly see to turn. And anyway, I think that's just opposite of if they're bragging corn growers. I'm a corn grower too, but we didn't do that. But about soil erosion, that's certainly, if that's going to be the new practice, that is not going to help soil erosion.
I think you make a good point. I would just say, I think it's pretty obvious there was more of that done this year than the past. And it's, the price of forage is high. It's difficult to get a hold of. And I think in some cases, farmers weigh the value of that stock as sold as forage versus improving or conserving soil is a trade-off. But if we get into a situation where forage is not that difficult to find or is expensive, then you'll probably see less of that being done. It's not a very high-quality forage, but we're in a situation this year where it's so short that they just needed fiber.
Yeah, and there wasn't much forage planted in our area at all, but I hope that doesn't become a common practice.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Most of these questions, I got a couple of questions, but they're more federal, but I believe you'd know it. The difference between an H-2B and H-2A visa.
I don't know that, but I can find out.
I think a lot of it has to do with their education aspect on that.
There's multiple types of visas.
How long is the complaint I get is a lot of our farmers, they'll get good workers from South Africa or somewhere, and they have them for 3 or 4 years, and all of a sudden they can't get a visa. Why? I mean,
Well,
they're just frustrated.
you know, it's my understanding that a lot of the immigration, the visas are driven by law that has been quite archaic and maybe hasn't kept up with the times. And so that's part of the real plea to update and change the law. Some of those programs, you can only be here for 9 months and have to go back, and that doesn't fit a lot of our workers either. There's one visa program where you can bring in skilled workers, and I know one swine operation is using veterinarians, trained veterinarians from other countries. Their spouse can come with them, but their spouse can't work. I mean, so there's just a lot of nuances that I think hinder making this work more effectively.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Senator Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's an idea that I've been hearing about two of these sectors that you have highlighted here. The hemp growers would love to be able to use their high protein, frankly higher than alfalfa is what I'm hearing, in pet food. What is holding us back from being able to do that?
Any ingredient in animal feed, pets or food animals, has to be approved by FDA. And FDA has not yet approved it. And they won't until there's research that verifies the safety and the viability of it. Does it actually provide the nutritional value that's claimed? So that's the holdup, is getting FDA approval on these products. Both there's probably more difficult to get approval for animals than it is people. The irony of that.
Isn't it? I have heard that on the federal level, there's some push to get them to get in gear. They've had time, and they're not producing an answer for some reason. And anyway, there's to accelerate that process. Thank you.
I agree.
I have a question. Back on the avian flu in wild birds, I mean, what's their symptoms? People.
They die. They get sick. Just like, I think there's some respiratory indications, maybe heavy, hard to breathe, discharge, but they don't live very long. In fact, some of those that we hear about and go in and do the investigation, by the time we get there to depopulate, they've lost a good number of them. So they die pretty fast.
Okay.
So if you see, probably in a wild bird situation, if you see, you're not going to see many sick ones. I would suspect you'll see dead ones.
Well, I'd never seen one yet, I don't think, but some people called Lake Afton and they said birds with avian flu will swim around in circles,
That's possible.
just like they're disoriented, then they end up dying. But
Yep, that could be.
when you
Makes sense.
When you dispose of those, they bury them or burn them. What do they do with it?
So when those disposal of those that we depopulate is primarily burial. I think we did a landfill with one. I believe we did a digester on a very small group, a digester at Kansas State University. But the larger ones are buried, and with coordination with KDHE, because we have to work with the landowner on where he or she wants them buried, and then we have to look and check the water table and some of those things, just as you would on any kind of burial.
What's the hierarchy? If somebody turns one in, is it wildlife and parks? Where do they fit in, or is it Department of Agriculture assumes?
So the Division of Animal Health in the Kansas Department of Ag assumed responsibility, and we work some with USDA. Other states have helped us because sometimes they have equipment that works better for depopulation. But we consult with KDHE on the burial. We have some collaboration with Wildlife and Parks, but there's no process of trying to dispose of the wild birds who are diseased.
Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation here. Feral hogs. I just wondered, that was kind of a big deal a couple of years ago, and I haven't heard quite as much about that, but then I heard something the other day. I just wondered if there's been more sightings, how you're feeling about, is this still an issue? Might comment on that.
Yes, there has been a little bit of news. So yes, it's still an issue. We've repeatedly asked for the legislature, and they've continued to provide funding for feral swine. So the Kansas legislature provides $150,000 state general funds that comes to our agency. We enter into an agreement with USDA's Wildlife Services, and they do the monitoring, trapping, and responding to cases when they hear about them, and they're fairly quick response. We just got a report a couple weeks ago that in 2022, they removed 383 feral pigs in Kansas. Over 200 of those were in Bourbon and Lynn County. That's the hot spot we have in this state. There was 162 removed in Cowley and Chautauqua County. And then there was a small number, 15, in Reno and Sedgwick County. They believe the Reno-Sedgwick County, that Ark River area, was actually an illegal release that we know occurs on occasion. But USDA has really perfected the trapping of those, and compared to our neighboring states, particularly Oklahoma and Missouri, where they have thousands of them, and that's our threat. Is the migration. That's our primary threat, is the migration of those feral swine from Missouri and Oklahoma. There's some threat from people that may want to bring them in illegally, but the biggest threat, I believe, is just the migration, which is why we always plea, if we keep trapping and doing away with those as we find them. Those 383, if half of those were gilts, you can imagine 150 of those having a couple litters next year, and you can just see how quickly it responds.
Senator Reichman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much for coming. You loaded us with all kinds of information, and it's very good. So the question I'm going to focus on, you gave us a chart on the total value of egg production by location 2017. You told the 10 top counties, 4 of them were in my district, okay? So we know, obviously, egg is very, very important. But then we talked about, of course, water, or the lack of it, or whatever, obviously is very, very big. And you talked about where they are measuring like 1,000 wells, and they're starting in January. We should know in a few months.
Mm-hmm. We'll know what the water table is, where it's at compared to last year and previous years.
Oh, right, okay. And help me with that. Normally, if we have a normal year, to replenish our water and whatever in the aquifer, it fairly well does okay through our irrigation and whenever, but when we have a drought, we see a significant drop in it. Would that be a fair statement?
It would be fair.
Yes, okay. So if we come through and we check these and we see that there's, drop 7, 8, 10, 12 feet in these across there, and of course, it's not even, there's some areas we have it for 250 years, we have it where some are right on the border. So I know it's going to be a tough whatever we come up with. But I'm sure you guys, your group or your ag, as far as other people, are looking at what are some options or to help give us some. What I'm asking is help giving us some guidelines to help making some decisions if the information we get is not what we want to hear. If it's a big drop, what we're going to do, because we just need some help, get some guidance. We don't want to be out of water, but as you said before, the ag industry is so important for all aspects of Kansas. And I just ask you to kind of comment on that. Thank you.
So one of the responses I usually have is, I believe we have statutory tools in place, particularly if those at the local level want to take a different course. And in some cases, those are being implemented. I don't know if you're going to hear from the chief engineer or not this session. So, but the chief engineer has certain responsibilities, particularly on impairment. If a junior water right's being impaired, that person's going to be expected to do something about it. So, it's a good policy decision or discussion. Does the state need to have a different statutory policy? I'm not suggesting you do, but it's how much of it's local responsibility and how much of it's going to be state responsibility. I don't have the answer to that. That's what it boils down to. And it's more critical and time sensitive in some areas of the state than it is other areas.
I have a question off the topic. Last session, we allocated $350,000 for the needs assessment for the dairy. Would you update us on where we're on that and how that's progressing?
So we just received a preliminary report. It's basically a two-pager that talks about the growth of dairy industry, the expected growth, what that means for the economy, what that means for inputs, feed, forage, how many people it's expected to be employed. We haven't seen yet what I think was supposed to be coming late January, early February, a more complete report in regards to, is there a role that a facility at Kansas State University can meet that would help facilitate or enhance that? So I don't know if you've seen, I can provide you the two-page infographic. If you haven't seen that, I can get that to you, but we're waiting for the final report, and we expect that fairly soon.
Do you expect anything on food science? Like, they have a processing plant there, dairy, they manufacture ice cream and stuff in their small plant. And I've heard a lot of people talk about food science experience, testing down the road, new products and stuff. Is that, matter of fact, people who we called to find out how to predict what we can do for the dairy industry in Kansas, and that's what their direction was, food science. Processing, and
Yeah.
making that more available.
I hope that's part of that, but I don't know if it's going to be the main emphasis. What I can do is get you the scope statement that basically is the direction that went to the consultant as to what we wanted to receive in the report and what we have so far. That'll be helpful.
Yeah, that'd be fine. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Secretary Beam, for being here. I hope you agree that the Kansas Geological Survey has been very helpful in our understanding of the water issues. I think I've been made aware that we fund them, I mean, they're not employees of the state, right? They're
The Geological Survey?
Geological Survey.
I don't know.
And they're not employees, I didn't think of the University of Kansas. So they do get funds from the state for the work that they do, but there's not been much of an increase in the last 20 years, and they've been left out of the employee increases that the state has provided, either through the Regents institutions or through state employees. So I very much appreciate all the information we've had about water. That's can put us in a much better place. And so I think we want to make sure that we are in a position to continue to have that working relationship between the state and the Geological Survey.
I do agree. I know our Division of Water Resources have repeatedly mentioned how great they are to work with and cooperate for many years. I mean, they're largely responsible for these graphs. A lot of the data is collected, from our water use reports that come through the Division of Water Resources. That's made available to the Geological Survey, so there's a good relationship there, and we couldn't have done all this. The projections that I would suggest maybe no other state in the High Plains Aquifer has this kind of data, and they're largely responsible for that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was on recruitment and retention. I was wondering, Secretary Beam, as far as what kind of money you spend on advertising on TV for employees. It seems like you just see ads from the state all the time. That costs money. And when you hire somebody, do you track what brought them to you? Just to kind of get a feel where that's really coming from? Because I look at this, and we could talk all day on that, but child care, health care, how that kind of stuff fits into what people's really looking for, because that's a big issue over all areas. So was there any one thing that kind of jumped at you with the stuff that you read?
Well, I did note that at least I think some were surprised that employee referral was one of the more successful approach. But as far as our agency, we don't spend any advertising. It's all through the internet sources. But we have many openings. Thank you. Oh, you did mention the magazine, so we have provided you with a new magazine of ag. We have some extras, and I think we even have a box. So if you have if you have a doctor's appointment, take one maybe and leave it. That's how I spread them around. Thank you.